Pep Guardiola. In fact, modern football can quite literally be split up into pre-Pep era and post-Pep era. Watching most top teams today, Pep Guardiola has his fingerprints all over them, having changed the way managers think, the way goalkeepers, centre-backs, full-backs, pivots, midfielders and forwards all play. In fact, the only position where he hasn't had much influence is the winger. But let's examine exactly how Pep has influenced all of these different departments. Pep Guardiola may not have invented any of the concepts mentioned, but he definitely played the most important role in reintroducing them to the modern audience. And it all kicked off when he burst onto the scene with the Barcelona side of 2008. Barcelona had plenty of talent within their side, having won the Champions League not too long prior. However, they were underperforming, and when Pep came in for Rijkaard, the impact was instant. Perhaps the most important thing was that in an era where most managers were more pragmatic and focused on game-by-game adaptations, Pep embraced an overall philosophy that he stuck with, almost dogmatically. The key tenets of this were high possession, numerical superiority, and high pressing, as well as anything else that falls under the Juego de Posición umbrella. These are the very principles that almost every top team also looks to embrace. And not just top teams, even smaller teams attempt to do this in order to overcome the budget and talent deficits with the top teams by working together as a unit and emphasizing the collective over the individual. And the scaffolding that Pep used to support this philosophy was the 4-3-3, as he deemed it the best for this possession philosophy. Again, it was a formation that many teams were using, but across the continent, it wasn't long before Pep's success saw many teams who had opted for the 4-2-3-1, 4-4-2, or a back three meld into a 4-3-3 as they looked to emulate the success. But simply lining up players in a 4-3-3 was just a sub-note of how Pep made this philosophy work. To make it work successfully, the way attacks themselves began had to be adapted. But the problem with this is that the numerical superiority was a big element of Pep's philosophy. But if they were playing against an aggressive pressing side, there was a possibility of a 10 versus 10 on the ball, meaning that there would be an over-dependence on individual quality. That is, unless he had an ace up his sleeve. A goalkeeper so good on the ball that he could count as the 11th man. This meant that unless the opposition keeper was crazy enough to join the press, they would always have the advantage. So Pep demanded that the goalkeeper not only be technical enough to play intricate passes to the man who became free when the keeper was pressed, but also brave enough not to panic when he did come under pressure. Valdez learned to do this for him. Neuer was ahead of the curve and could already do so, whilst Joe Hart had to be disposed of to eventually bring in Edison. And now as more and more top teams move toward possession football, they know it's almost impossible to implement it without a ball-playing keeper. So otherwise top goalies like Edouard Mendy and David De Gea can almost directly thank Pep for almost constantly being cross-examined. And like we said before, when defending, it would take a borderline crazy manager to get his keeper to join in the press. Pep is basically a borderline crazy manager, so when his side is pressing with their high line on the halfway line, the gap for the potential through ball from the opposition has grown. So, in order to shrink that space, the starting position of the goalkeeper has had to adapt, usually to just outside the box, so that if a man is played through, the goalkeeper is ready to sweep. But the transformation of goalkeepers is just the tip of the iceberg. Under pressure, fine touch. That used to be the common motto for centre-backs, who were not expected to be good on the ball. At best, they could look to be decent long passers, searching for the big target man or balls into the channel. But Pep understood that these long balls would take the ball from being 100% controlled by his team to a 50-50 aerial ball. And the ball-playing goalkeeper was most likely going to be looking to find the centre-backs, so they had to be not just solid on the ball, but great. And in his early days, before a rule change to the goal kick allowed players to receive inside the box, if the centre-backs had maintained their normal position, the opposition forwards would be able to instantly put them under pressure. So Pep began to drop them extremely deep and wide with a pivot on the edge of the box, meaning that the opposition would have to commit at least 4 players for a man-to-man press, leaving a 7 versus 6 higher up once the ball became active. And after the rule change, Pep also looked to get one or two centre-backs to receive straight from the goalkeeper. Still, the end goal being to draw the opposition higher up the pitch to create space in midfield and up front. And even when the team was higher, the centre-backs had to be much more like orchestrators than previous editions of them, looking to play big switches as well as line-breaking passes. But of course, it's still difficult for centre-backs to be as influential on the ball as midfielders. And that wasn't a problem because of... In some prior teams, the defensive midfielder was mainly a destroyer, who, at best, just looked to be decent on the ball and give it to more talented players. More dynamic teams didn't even employ a pivot, instead often having box-to-box midfielders who were more runners on and off the ball. But Pep popularized having the defensive midfielder be the beating heart of the team, the hub around which everything else rotated. And in this first phase, Pep was also one of the chief exponents of La Salida La Volpiana. In open play, teams with the front two could go man-to-man against the centre-backs, but Pep began to drop his defensive midfielders between the centre-backs to always have a man advantage. The pivot, who also had to be excellent on the ball, would then have the space to dictate from deep, or would draw an opposition midfielder out of position. This pattern of play, as well as having a highly technical defensive midfielder, has now become the standard procedure for most teams. This takes us on to one of his most recent and most distinctive innovations. The position of the fullback had been evolving in the few seasons before Pep came in. Fullbacks were now expected to be highly attacking, and their main role was to overlap, particularly when paired with inverted wingers, who'd be cutting inside. So, in general, they operated in these large, long lines. But Pep's experience in the Bundesliga forced him to adapt, and as a result, the rest of world football had a fresh new inspiration. Playing with his old system with Bayern, he quickly realized that teams in Germany were unbelievable on the transition. This meant that effectively having three men back to defend consistently left them vulnerable. But he also knew that his best attackers in the side were the wide men in Robben and Ribéry, and they were both unbelievable in 1-versus-1 situations. And Pep wanted to create these 1v1s as often as possible, so having traditional overlapping fullbacks drawing across extra defenders was not needed. At Bayern Munich, he just happened to have two of the very best on-the-ball fullbacks in world football, David Alaba and Philipp Lahm. So, to kill two birds with one stone, Pep moved his fullbacks inside into the midfield position, thus preserving the 1v1s out wide, and also meaning that now on the transition, it was a solid block of 5 to get past, rather than just a 3. So very quickly, the fullbacks went from essentially being used in the final third to cross, to becoming players who saw more of the ball than most other outfielders. And this demanded that the fullbacks become more and more technically proficient, a trend that we will no doubt see continue. And having fullbacks essentially opened up a new possibility for midfielders. Now having less responsibility when the inverted fullbacks were present, at Manchester City, Pep introduced the free 8. Before his arrival, many had speculated whether it would be Kevin De Bruyne or David Silva who would get free reign as the 10 in this team. If you wanted to play both, surely one would have to move wide, which they both had experience of doing. But with a dependable hub in Fernandinho, as well as two inverted fullbacks, Pep decided to effectively play with two 10s. These two midfielders in extremely deep phases would play as traditional central midfielders, but when high would take up positions normally taken up by a roaming 10. But with the responsibility and threat now split between two, they could effectively split zone 14 in half, each effectively operating in one of the half spaces outside the forward. And where before, even when training, coaches would split up the pitch into zones as follows, with this area, zone 14, being viewed as the most important region. Now, Pep's way of seeing football saw the pitch split up like this instead, with the emphasis now being on occupying these zones, the half spaces. This would allow the formation of a front 5 in attack, which would overload most back fours, allowing the wingers and the men in the half spaces to form a strong bond. Second strikers were nothing new in football, but most of the time they were just that, secondary roaming strikers playing off of another forward. And at Barcelona, with the arrival of Zlatan, it looked like he would be the centre forward, with Messi remaining at right wing. Perhaps at a push, Messi would be the secondary forward off of Zlatan. But Pep chose to get rid of Ibrahimovic entirely, and use Messi as a lone secondary forward, with no one ahead of him, which is referred to as a false nine. The false nine would have to be highly match intelligent, knowing when to make runs in behind to stretch the defense, when to go over to the width to cause the overload, but more importantly, especially with the defensive midfielder dropping deep, it was crucial for this forward to be able to drop into the midfield on occasion to prevent them being overloaded, and the false nine had to be technical enough to actually operate as a midfielder. If the defensive midfielder was also high, it would allow them to have the central overload, helping that possession-oriented football. Pep Guardiola may not have invented all of these per se, but his combination of these and the success and flair his teams play with has influenced a generation of managers and has literally defined how football is played all the way from top teams down to non-league football. This is